The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead like frozen stars. The clinking of champagne flutes echoed through the grand dining hall, a symphony of wealth and power. Laughter spilled from the lips of oil tycoons, investors, and perfectly polished Southern wives, each sound a reminder of a world I once observed from the outside. Everyone inside the bank's estate was toasting another multi-million-dollar deal. No one noticed that someone was missing, except me. Through the frosted glass doors, barely visible in the moonlight's silver glow, I saw her. Annabelle, my daughter, the heiress, the girl I raised to question everything, shivering on the frozen stone balcony in a silk dress with no coat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her skin pale as porcelain, her lips trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. I burst through the French doors without a second thought. Without hesitation, I scooped her into my arms. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. "Mama, I didn't think anyone would come for me." I carried her inside. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks froze mid-air. Even Thomas Banks, the billionaire patriarch himself, fell silent, his eyes narrowing at the disruption of his perfectly orchestrated evening. I looked straight into the eyes of the shareholders, the bankers, the predators in pearls and tailored suits, and I said 5 words that detonated like a bomb in that suffocating room of privilege. I know about the buyout. 5 years ago, my daughter Annabelle married into one of Texas's most powerful families, the Banks dynasty. Oil money, politics, land older than the state itself. Their name opened every door in Houston and locked a few behind it, too. I'm Caroline Whitaker, a single mother who built a modest interior design business in Austin with nothing but determination and an eye for beauty in broken things. I raised Annabelle to see the world clearly, to question authority, to stand firm in her convictions. But even the strongest foundations can crack under enough pressure. When she first brought Preston Banks to Sunday dinner at my small craftsman home, I saw the way he looked at my mismatched chairs and hand-me-down crystal, not with disdain, but with something worse, pity. He called me ma'am, with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Perfect teeth, perfect posture, perfect emptiness behind his gaze. "Your daughter is exceptional, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, swirling the wine I couldn't afford in a glass I'd saved for special occasions. A rare find in today's landscape. I wanted to ask what landscape he meant, but Annabelle beamed beside him, radiant in a way I hadn't seen before. She'd always been beautiful, intelligent, fierce, compassionate, but now she glowed with something I recognized too well, the intoxicating feeling of being chosen. "Preston's family has a foundation that funds arts education in underserved schools," she told me later, her eyes bright with purpose. "They want me to help direct it. I could make a real difference, Mom." I should have seen it then. The careful cultivation, the strategic positioning, but I wanted to believe in her. Happiness. The engagement came 3 months later, a 5-carat diamond that looked impossibly heavy on her delicate hand. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" I asked her the night before the wedding, as we sat in her childhood bedroom surrounded by packed boxes. "Marriage isn't just about love, it's about values, family, who you become together." Annabelle took my hands in hers. "He makes me feel like I can be more than I am, Mom. Like I can be part of something bigger." "You've always been part of something bigger," I whispered. "You've been part of us." The wedding was held at the Banks estate, a sprawling southern mansion with white columns and red roses. Security guards with earpieces watched the guests with military precision. I wore a dress I'd saved 3 months to buy and still felt underdressed among the senators' wives and oil executives. Thomas Banks, Preston's father, approached me at the reception. 6'2" with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed everything in terms of value and weakness. "Caroline," he said, not a question but a statement. "I hope you understand what this union means. The Banks family isn't just wealth, it's legacy, tradition, discipline." "My daughter understands commitment," I replied, straightening my spine. "She was raised with values money can't buy." He smiled thinly. "Everything has a price, Caroline, one way or another." I watched Annabelle leave in a white Rolls-Royce, looking back at me one last time before disappearing behind tinted windows. That was the last time I saw my daughter, truly saw her, for a very long time. The changes were subtle at first. Phone calls that became shorter, less frequent. Her vibrant social media transformed into carefully curated photos of charity galas and garden parties. Always smiling, perfectly styled, rarely speaking. When I visited their Houston mansion, Preston was unfailingly polite but perpetually present. He answered questions directed at Annabelle. He reminded her of, appointments that conveniently cut our visits short. He placed his hand on her lower back, not a gesture of affection, but of control, of ownership. "We should get together more often," I said during one such abbreviated visit, watching Annabelle's eyes dart to Preston before she responded. "We're just so busy with the foundation and Preston's father's campaigns," she said. Her voice had changed, higher, more measured, each word seeming rehearsed. "But I'll check our calendar." 2 years into the marriage, the invitations to visit became rare. When I called, staff members answered with practiced responses. "Mrs. Banks is attending a function. Mrs. Banks is resting. Mrs. Banks will return your call." She rarely did. Then came the dinner invitation that would change everything. Heavy cream envelope with gold-embossed lettering. "The Banks family requests the honor of your presence for Christmas Eve dinner." A handwritten note from Annabelle was tucked inside. "Please come, Mom. I need you." The ink was smudged in one corner, as if a drop of water had fallen there. Or a tear. Something was wrong. A mother always knows. I arrived at the Banks estate on Christmas Eve, the mansion even more imposing in winter. Icicle lights hung from the eaves, and towering evergreens flanked the entrance, each decorated with thousands of white lights and red ornaments. A valet took my 10-year-old Volvo with barely concealed disdain. Inside, the foyer buzzed with activity. Staff in formal attire arranged flower displays and polished already gleaming surfaces. A string quartet rehearsed in an adjacent room. "I'm Caroline Whitaker, Annabelle's mother," I told a young woman with a clipboard who intercepted me before I could move further into the house. "Yes, ma'am. You're at table 3 in the East Wing. Dinner will be served at 7. She glanced at her watch. "That's in 90 minutes. I'd like to see my daughter before dinner." The woman's professional smile faltered. "Mrs. Banks is preparing. Mr. Banks has requested that guests remain in the designated reception areas." That's when the first red flag turned into a blaring siren. "I'm not a guest," I said firmly. "I'm her mother. Where is she?" "Mrs. Whitaker," a deep voice interrupted. Thomas Banks approached, immaculate in a black tuxedo. "Welcome to our home. Again." The way he said "again" made it clear I was an intruder, not family. "Where's Annabelle?" I asked directly. "My daughter-in-law is attending to some family matters before our celebration begins." His smile never reached his cold eyes. "Perhaps you'd enjoy a tour of our new East Wing gallery? We've acquired several pieces I believe would interest someone with your aesthetic background." I recognized the deflection, the subtle condescension, but I also knew when to choose my battles. "That would be lovely," I lied. As he led me through hallways lined with artwork worth more than my entire life's earnings, I listened to his practiced monologue about provenance and value while scanning every doorway, every staircase, searching for a glimpse of my daughter. And then I saw it, a flash of familiar movement through a window overlooking an upper terrace. A woman in blue silk, her blonde hair catching the last light of day. Annabelle. But she wasn't preparing or attending to family matters. She was alone on a balcony in freezing December air, without a coat, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out at nothing. And something in me knew with absolute certainty, this was no choice. This was punishment. The dining hall of the Banks estate resembled a scene from another century, a time when power was displayed through excess and cruelty was disguised as tradition. 5 crystal chandeliers hung above a table that could seat 40, each place setting worth more than most people's monthly salary. The walls were adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced Banks ancestors and hunting trophies. The glassy eyes of taxidermied deer and elk staring down at the guests with frozen horror. I was seated between a state senator and the wife of an energy executive. My place card read Mrs. C. Whitaker in elegant calligraphy. Not Annabelle's mother, not Caroline, just a designation, a formality, a necessary inconvenience. Preston sat near his father at the head of the table, engaged in animated conversation with investors. His Harvard charm was on full display. Perfect teeth, perfect laugh, perfect lies rolling off his tongue about sustainable practices and community investment. But Annabelle's chair remained empty. Dinner began with a toast from Thomas Banks. He stood, commanding the room with nothing more than his presence. Conversations hushed, servers froze in place. "To family," he declared, raising his crystal flute. "The bedrock of our great nation and the foundation of the Banks' legacy. to discipline, tradition, and knowing one's place in the greater order of things. His eyes swept the table, lingering pointedly on the empty chair beside Preston. No one mentioned it. No one dared. As the first course arrived, caviar on tiny blinis with creme fraiche, I found myself unable to eat. My eyes kept drifting to the French doors leading to the terrace where I'd glimpsed Annabelle earlier. Now they showed only darkness and swirling snow. "Your daughter seems to be running late," the senator's wife whispered to me, her tone suggesting both curiosity and judgment. "Yes," I replied simply, unwilling to feed the gossip mill I could already sense churning around me. By the third course, a butternut squash soup with truffle oil, my worry had transformed into something harder, sharper. I caught Preston checking his watch, his expression a mixture of annoyance and satisfaction that made my stomach turn. And then I saw it. A shadow moving across the frosted glass of the terrace doors, a flutter of blue silk, a hand pressed briefly against the pane, leaving a melting outline. Without excusing myself, I stood. Napkin dropped, chair scraping against hardwood. Heads turned, but I didn't care. I walked directly to the French doors, ignoring Preston's call of "Mrs. Whitaker" behind me. I pushed the doors open against the winter wind and stepped onto the stone terrace. There she was, my daughter, huddled against the balustrade, her silk dress offering no protection against the biting December cold. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her shoulders shook with violent tremors. Tear tracks had frozen on her cheeks. "Annabelle," I breathed, rushing to her side. She looked up, her eyes glassy from cold, and what I suspected was more than just physical pain. "Mom," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe I was real. "I didn't think anyone would come." Without hesitation, I removed my cashmere wrap, the nicest thing I owned, and draped it around her shoulders. Then I gathered her into my arms as I had when she was a child awakening from nightmares. "How long have you been out here?" I demanded, rubbing her arms to restore circulation. "Since before guests arrived," she said through chattering teeth. 3, maybe 4 hours." "My God, Annabelle, why?" Her eyes flicked toward the dining room, visible through the glass. "I corrected Preston," she whispered. "At lunch, about a land deal, in front of his father. Thomas said I needed to reflect on my place in this family." Fury rose in me like a tidal wave, not hot, but ice-cold and all-consuming. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't tradition. This was calculated cruelty designed to break a spirit I had spent 28 years nurturing. "Can you walk?" I asked, already knowing I would carry her if necessary. She nodded weakly. I wrapped my arm around her waist and guided her toward the doors. When we reached them, she hesitated. "Mom, I can't. Thomas will do nothing," I said with quiet certainty. "Not tonight. Not ever again." We stepped through the doors together, and every head in the dining room turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The string quartet faltered and stopped. Preston half rose from his chair, his face a mask of practiced concern that couldn't quite hide his shock at seeing his wife indoors. Thomas Banks did not stand. He merely placed his fork beside his plate with deliberate precision, his eyes narrowing at our interruption. "Annabelle appears unwell," I announced to the room, my voice steadier than I felt. "She needs warmth and rest." "My daughter-in-law is fine," Thomas countered smoothly, perhaps overexcited about the holidays. "Preston, escort your mother-in-law back to her seat while Annabelle composes herself." Preston moved toward us, but I stepped forward, still supporting Annabelle's trembling form. "Your daughter-in-law has hypothermia," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "from being locked outside for hours in freezing temperatures, as punishment for speaking." The room went silent, not the polite hush of high society, but the stunned silence of witnesses to something they couldn't pretend not to see. "That's absurd," Preston sputtered. "Annabelle chose to get some air. She's been emotional lately, irrational. We've been concerned about her mental health, haven't we, Father?" Thomas nodded sagely. "Perhaps this outburst confirms our concerns. Caroline, you're embarrassing yourself and your daughter with these dramatic allegations." I looked at the faces around the table, wealthy, powerful people who had built empires on looking the other way. But I also saw flickers of discomfort, of recognition. The senator's wife was staring at Annabelle's blue-tinged lips. An older man, a major shareholder I'd learn later, was frowning at the frost still melting in her hair. The truth was visible, undeniable, and I had one card left to play. "I know about the buyout," I said quietly. 5 simple words. But they hit with the force of a wrecking ball. Thomas Banks went perfectly. Still, Preston's face drained of color. Several guests exchanged alarmed glances. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. "The land acquisitions, the rezoning applications, the Native American burial site that's mysteriously been reclassified, the offshore accounts, all of it." I met his gaze directly. "I know." The room erupted in tense whispers. I felt Annabelle straighten beside me, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside herself. "Mom worked in commercial real estate compliance," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, "before she became a designer. And I found the files on Preston's laptop. I was going to say something, make it right. That's why they isolated you." I finished for her. "Cut you off from everyone who loved you, kept you under control." Thomas Banks rose from his chair with dangerous grace. "This dinner party is concluded," he announced. "Our family is dealing with a private matter. I must ask our guests to excuse us." But it was too late. The damage was done. The ice had cracked beneath the perfect Banks facade, and the dark waters were rising fast. Thomas Banks was a man who had never lost control of his business, his family, or the carefully curated narrative of his dynasty. But as he stood at the head of that opulent table, watching his guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs, I saw something flicker across his face that I recognized immediately. Fear. "Mr. Harrington," he called to a silver-haired man near the far end of the table. "Perhaps you could escort the other guests to the drawing room for brandy while we address this family matter." Harrington, who I would later learn was Banks Consolidated's chief legal counsel, nodded grimly and began to usher people from the room. Some went reluctantly, casting curious glances over their shoulders. Others couldn't leave fast enough, as if proximity to scandal might be contagious. Preston moved toward Annabelle, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Darling," he said, reaching for her arm, "you're clearly unwell. Let me take you upstairs." She flinched away from his touch, pressing closer to my side. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 5 years of suppressed defiance. Thomas Banks waited until the last guest had exited, then closed the dining room doors with a decisive click. When he turned back to us, his mask of civility had dropped entirely. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, each word precise as a surgeon's cut. "The implications of your little performance tonight." "I know exactly what I've done," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I've come for my daughter." He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Your daughter? She's a Banks now. She made that choice 5 years ago, signing contracts more binding than you could possibly understand." "Prenuptial agreements don't cover criminal activity," I said calmly. "Criminal activity?" Preston interjected, finding his voice. "That's libelous, Caroline. We're developers, business people. Everything we do is fully vetted by our legal team." "Including the rezoning of federally protected native land through shell companies?" I asked. "The environmental impact reports that somehow never mentioned the aquifer that feeds 3 counties? The donations to planning commissioners who mysteriously changed their votes?" The color drained from Preston's face. Thomas remained impassive, but I noticed his hand tighten around the back of a chair. "You've been investigating us," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Annabelle spoke up, her voice stronger now. "I have. For months. Ever since I found the Clearwater Project files." Thomas's eyes snapped to his daughter-in-law, narrowing dangerously. "You had no right to access those documents. They were on my husband's laptop," she countered. "The laptop he leaves open in our home. The home where I'm kept like a prisoner, trotted out for parties and photos, but never allowed to speak my mind." "We gave you everything," Preston hissed. "A position at the foundation, status, a life most women would kill for." "A gilded cage is still a cage," I said quietly. Thomas Banks moved then, crossing to a sideboard where he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, with steady hands. The dining room fell silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock, and Annabelle's still labored breathing. "What exactly do you want?" he finally asked, turning to face us. "Money? A better position for Annabelle and the company? Everyone has a price." "I want out," Annabelle said before I could respond. "Divorce. freedom, and I want no part in whatever you're doing at Clearwater. Thomas exchanged a look with his son that sent a chill down my spine. Not anger, but calculation. These men never lost. They simply changed strategies. A divorce would be unfortunate, Thomas said carefully. Messy, public. I'm not sure you've considered how that might affect your mother's small business, or her reputation. The threat hung in the air, clear as crystal. Are you threatening me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Thomas smiled thinly. I'm simply pointing out that actions have consequences. For everyone. That's when I reached into my evening bag and removed my phone. With deliberate slowness, I placed it on the table and pressed a button. You're live, I said. A woman's voice filled the room, clear and authoritative. I've reviewed the documents. You sent me, Caroline, she said. We'll be launching a formal investigation into Banks Consolidated's land acquisitions effective immediately. I've already forwarded the files to the Environmental Protection Agency and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The voice belonged to Diana Chen, the Texas Energy Board chair, and my former college roommate, the woman who had given me her personal cell number. When Annabelle first got engaged, saying, "The Banks family plays rough. Call me if you ever need backup." Thomas Banks went completely still. Preston's mouth opened and closed without sound. That was Diana Chen, I said unnecessarily. We went to UT together, sorority sisters. She's very thorough. You recorded us without consent, Preston finally managed. That's illegal in Texas. Check your facts, I replied. Texas is a one-party consent state. And besides, I didn't record our conversation. I made a call before I came inside. Diana's been listening since I found Annabelle on the terrace. Thomas set his glass down with careful precision. This changes nothing, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. We have resources you can't imagine. Connections in every level of government. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But you've built your empire on one crucial foundation, secrecy, and that's gone now. I turned to my daughter, who stood straighter now, color returning to her cheeks. Let's go. She hesitated, just for a moment, then nodded. I want a divorce, she said clearly, looking directly at Preston, and I want no part of this family's business. We turned to leave, and neither man moved to stop us. But Thomas Banks had one parting shot. You'll regret this, he called after us. Both of you. The Banks family protects its own, but we destroy our enemies. At the doorway, Annabelle paused and looked back at the man who had terrorized her for 5 years. That's the difference between us, Thomas, she said quietly. I don't have enemies. I just have the truth. We walked out of the dining room, through the grand foyer where clusters of guests whispered among themselves, and into the clear, cold night. The valet brought my Volvo around, and we climbed in without looking back at the mansion glowing with light and seething with secrets. As we drove down the long, winding driveway, Annabelle began to cry. Not the silent tears she'd shed on the awing terrace, but deep, body-racking sobs of relief and fear and 5 years of suppressed emotion. I reached across the console and took her hand. It's over, I told her. No, she said, wiping her eyes. It's just beginning. She was right. We had lit a match in a room full of dynamite, and the explosion was coming. But for the first time in years, we would face it together. The media frenzy began. The next morning, I woke at dawn in my small craftsman home to find Annabelle already in the kitchen, wrapped in my old terry cloth robe, staring at her phone with wide eyes. It's everywhere, she said without looking up. Someone at the dinner must have talked. I poured coffee into 2 mugs, chipped ceramics I'd bought at a local artist's market, nothing like the fine china she'd been using for years, and peered over her shoulder. The headline on the Houston Chronicle's website was tactfully vague. Questions arise about Banks family business practices. But the Texas Tribune pulled no punches. Banks consolidated under investigation for illegal land acquisitions. Social media was ablaze with speculation. Our Banks buyout was trending statewide. Diana works fast, I murmured, settling. Beside her, at my small breakfast nook, a far cry from the marble-countered kitchen of the Banks estate. They'll try to bury it, Annabelle said, her voice hollow with certainty, born of years watching the family operate. They have people at every major news outlet in Texas. Advertisers, investors, friends. I sipped my coffee, considering. They can slow it down, maybe. Control the narrative to some degree. But they can't stop a federal investigation once it's started. Her phone buzzed, Preston's name lighting up the screen. Then again, and again. She silenced it with trembling fingers. "He's called 17 times since midnight," she whispered. "Left voicemails, texts. You don't have to listen to them," I reminded her gently. "I know." She set the phone face down on the table. "But I need to know what they're planning, how they'll try to spin this." She was right. The Banks family wouldn't go down without a fight, and information was our only advantage. Together we listened to Preston's voicemails, each one revealing more desperation than the last. "Annabelle, darling, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Please come home so we can talk. This is all a massive overreaction. Father is very concerned about your mental state. If this is about having more freedom, we can discuss it. The foundation board position could be expanded." And finally, around 3 a.m., the mask slipping entirely. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What this could cost us? Cost you? Everything we've built could collapse because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." Annabelle's face remained impassive as she deleted each message. 5 years with the Banks family had taught her to hide her emotions well, too well. I wondered how long it would take for her to feel safe enough to be herself again. By noon, Thomas Banks had called a press conference. We watched it on my small television, Annabelle gripping my hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Thomas looked immaculate as always. Bespoke suit, perfect Windsor knot, the picture of wounded dignity as he addressed the cameras with Preston standing solemnly beside him. "Banks Consolidated has always operated with the highest ethical standards," he declared, his deep voice resonant with practiced sincerity. "These allegations are not only false, but appear to be part of a targeted campaign to damage our reputation during a time of expansion." He paused, his expression softening with rehearsed vulnerability. "On a personal note, our family is deeply concerned about my daughter-in-law, Annabelle. She has been struggling with certain issues for some time, and chose to leave our home last night during a family gathering. Annabelle, if you're watching, we love you. We're worried about you. Please come home so we can get you the help you need." The performance was masterful, casting Annabelle as unstable, themselves as the concerned family, the investigation as persecution. I felt nauseated watching it, but Annabelle's reaction surprised me. She laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Classic Thomas," she said, "always controlling the narrative, but he made a mistake." "What mistake?" I asked. "He mentioned me by name, made it personal. Now the media won't just want his side of the story." She turned to me, a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. "They'll want mine." By evening, Annabelle had received 7 interview requests from local and national outlets. Preston's calls had become more frequent, more desperate. Thomas had his assistant reach out, offering a private family meeting to resolve misunderstandings. We ignored them all. Instead, Annabelle contacted Diana Chen directly, arranging to provide formal testimony the following day. Then she called a lawyer, not one of the high-powered attorneys the Banks family had on retainer, but a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had a reputation for being absolutely fearless. That night, as we sat on my worn sofa with mugs of tea, Annabelle spoke more freely than she had in years. "I found the Clearwater files 3 months ago," she explained. "Preston left his laptop open while he took a call. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally, but a map caught my eye. Land I recognized from the Foundation's Cultural Preservation Initiative." She described discovering documents that revealed the Banks family's plan to extract oil from protected land, including a Native American burial ground, using a complex network of shell companies and falsified environmental reports. When I confronted Preston, he said I didn't understand business, that sometimes corners had to be cut for progress. Her voice hardened. Then Thomas took me aside and explained how things worked in their family, how wives were expected to support, not question, how my position, everything I had, depended on my discretion. "And they started watching you more closely," I guessed. She nodded. "My phone, my computer, my movements. The staff reported everything to Preston. I couldn't even go to the grocery store without a companion." She made air quotes around the word. "I tried to reach out to you, but they monitored my calls." "Why didn't you just leave?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me. Annabelle's eyes met mine, swimming with unshed tears. "They threatened you, Mom. Said they could destroy your business, your reputation. That accidents happen to people who cross the Banks family." She swallowed hard, and I believed them, because I'd seen it happen to others. I pulled her. into my arms, this daughter I'd raised to be strong and independent, who had endured silent terror to protect me. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," she said fiercely. "I'm not, because now we're going to stop them." The doorbell rang, startling us both. Through the peephole, I saw a delivery man holding a large bouquet of white roses, Annabelle's favorite. The card read simply, "Come home. P." Annabelle took one look and closed the door in the deliveryman's face. "Not flowers," she said quietly. "Not apologies. Not ever again." As darkness fell, we checked the locks twice and drew the blinds. Neither of us said aloud what we both knew. The Banks family didn't surrender what they considered theirs. And until yesterday, they had considered Annabelle their property. The war had just begun. The Texas winter sun cast long shadows across my living room floor as Diana Chen set down her government-issue laptop and fixed us with her direct gaze. In her navy pantsuit and sensible pumps, she looked exactly as she had in college, practical, uncompromising, and utterly fearless. "The evidence you've provided is compelling," she said, tapping a manila folder containing the documents. Annabelle had managed to secretly download before leaving the bank's estate, especially the rezoning applications filed through 7 different shell companies, all leading back to the same offshore account. "Thomas is careful," Annabelle said, perched on the edge of my sofa. "He never puts his name on anything directly. That's why I knew these were important when I found them. They were the only files Preston kept in an encrypted folder." Diana nodded thoughtfully. "Banks Consolidated has powerful friends. This investigation won't be quick or easy." She hesitated, then added, "And it won't be safe for either of you." I felt Annabelle stiffen beside me. "What do you mean?" "The Banks family doesn't just control oil and real estate," Diana explained. "They have investments in technology, private security firms, media outlets. They donate to police foundations across the state. They have resources that can make life uncomfortable for their opponents." "We're not just opponents," I pointed out. "Annabelle is family. Their son's wife." Diana's expression softened. "Caroline, in my experience, family is where the Banks men are most ruthless. They view disloyalty as the ultimate betrayal." As if on cue, my phone rang, an unknown number with a Houston area code. I answered on speaker. "Mrs. Whitaker," came the smooth voice of James Harrington, the Banks family's chief counsel. "I was hoping to speak with you regarding a sensitive matter." "I'm listening," I replied, catching Diana's eye. She nodded encouragingly. "The Banks family is prepared to be generous despite recent misunderstandings. They recognize that Annabelle may need time away, perhaps a vacation. They're offering a very comfortable stipend during this period of reflection." "A bribe," I translated. Harrington cleared his throat. "A gesture of good faith. Additionally, they're prepared to offer significant funding for your design business. An expansion, perhaps. New offices in Houston or Dallas." "In exchange for what?" Annabelle asked sharply. A pause. Harrington hadn't expected her to be listening. "Ah, Annabelle. Good. In exchange for discretion. Family matters should remain private after all, and certain documents should be returned to their rightful owners." Diana leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, this is Diana Chen, chair of the Texas Energy Board. Those documents are now evidence in an active investigation. Attempting to recover them could constitute obstruction of justice." The silence that followed was profound. When Harrington spoke again, the polished veneer had vanished from his voice. "Ms. Chen, I wasn't aware this had become an official matter. It became official the moment the Banks family used shell companies to acquire protected land," Diana replied, calmly. "Do pass that along to Thomas, won't you?" The call ended abruptly. Annabelle exhaled shakily, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "That's their first move," she said, "trying to buy us off. When that doesn't work, they'll start looking for pressure points. Which is why we need to move quickly," Diana said, standing. "I've arranged protection for both of you. A security detail. We'll be here within the hour." "Is that really necessary?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Diana's expression was grave. The first rule of taking on powerful men: expect them to use their power. All of it. She was right. By nightfall, my phone was ringing constantly. Clients suddenly canceling projects. The bank calling about irregularities with my business loan. A health inspector claiming there had been complaints about my home office. Annabelle received notification that her personal credit cards had been frozen due to suspicious activity. Her email was suddenly flooded with password reset attempts. Her phone began receiving texts from strangers, all variations of, "We know where you are." Through it all, Annabelle displayed a calm that bordered on eerie, methodically documented each harassment, forwarding evidence to Diana and her divorce attorney, Jessica Abrams. Where once she might have crumbled under the pressure, as the bank's men had conditioned her to do, she now stood firm. "They're predictable," she explained when I marveled at her composure. "Thomas has a playbook. First financial pressure, then isolation, then fear. I watched him do it to business rivals for years. And Preston?" I asked carefully. "What's his role in all this?" Annabelle's expression hardened. "Preston does whatever his father tells him to. He always has. That's why Thomas chose him as heir apparent instead of his older brother." "I didn't know Preston had a brother," I said, surprised. "Michael. He left the family business 10 years ago. Lives in Seattle now. Runs some tech startup." She hesitated. "Preston never talks about him, but I found a photo once. They look alike, but Michael's eyes were kinder." 3 days after Christmas, the media storm hit full force. The Houston Chronicle published a front-page exposé on the bank's family's questionable land deals. The Texas Tribune followed with a detailed timeline of environmental violations dating back 15 years. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle, a Texas oil dynasty against a young woman and her interior designer mother. Thomas Banks responded with a media blitz of his own, full-page ads touting the family's charitable contributions, interviews highlighting their job creation record, carefully placed stories suggesting that environmental regulations were stifling economic growth. But he made one critical error. In an interview with a sympathetic business channel, he referred to Annabelle as emotionally fragile and suggested that her accusations stemmed from women's troubles. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Women's advocacy groups issued statements condemning his remarks. Believe Annabelle began trending on social media. 3 female board members of banks Consolidated publicly resigned, and then came the call I'd been dreading. My biggest client, a boutique hotel chain that accounted for nearly half my annual revenue, terminating our contract effective immediately. "I'm sorry, Caroline," the owner said, genuine regret in his voice. "You do beautiful work, but we can't afford the association right now." Banks family has interests in properties adjacent to 3 of our locations. I hung up and stared at my design table, covered with fabric swatches and floor plans that were now worthless. My business, the one I'd built from nothing while raising Annabelle alone, was collapsing in real time. Annabelle found me there, my hands flat on the table, breathing deeply to hold back tears. "Mom?" she asked, softly. "What happened?" I told her about the hotel chain, about the 3 other clients who had canceled earlier that week, about the loans coming due with no revenue to cover them. "This is my fault," she whispered, her composure finally cracking. "I should have known they'd come after you first." I straightened my spine and turned to face her. "Listen to me. This is not your fault. This is Thomas Banks using the only weapon he has against strong women, financial pressure. He thinks if he breaks me, you'll break too. But your business is just that. A business. I built it once. I can build it again." I took her hands in mine. "What I couldn't rebuild is you. If you had stayed in that house with those men for even one more day..." The doorbell rang, interrupting us. One of the security officers Diana had assigned to us checked through the peephole, then opened the door. A courier handed him a large envelope, which he inspected thoroughly before bringing to us. "It's been screened," he assured us. "No threats detected." The envelope bore the logo of the Texas Attorney General's office. Inside was a formal letter requesting Annabelle's testimony in a newly opened investigation into Banks Consolidated's business practices, not just regarding the land acquisitions, but dating back 10 years and encompassing possible tax fraud, bribery of public officials, and environmental violations. Attached was a personal note from the Attorney General himself. "Your courage has opened a door long kept shut. We'll take it from here." Annabelle read it twice, then looked up at me with a mixture of vindication and fear. "It's really happening," she said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "And there's no going back now." That night, as a January storm lashed against the windows of my small home, Annabelle received one final text from Preston. "Father wants to meet. Just you. Tomorrow." Name the place. She showed me the message, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. It's a trap, I said immediately. Of course it is, she agreed. But it's also an opportunity. She typed a reply with steady fingers. Noon. The Magnolia Cafe on Westheimer. Public. Cameras everywhere. Preston's response came instantly. He'll be there. Annabelle set down her phone and looked at me with clear eyes. I need to face him one more time. On my terms. In the light. I wanted to argue, to protect her, but I recognized the determination in her expression. The same expression I'd seen in the mirror all the years I'd raised her alone, fighting for every opportunity, every advantage I could give her. I'll be with you, I promised. I know, she said. You always have been. The Magnolia Cafe was bustling with post-holiday shoppers and business people when we arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. I had chosen our seats carefully, a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances, near enough to other patrons for safety, but far enough for privacy. 2 plainclothes security officers from Diana's team positioned themselves at the counter and by the door. Annabelle wore a simple blue dress, not the designer labels Thomas had insisted upon, but a cotton-wrap dress that brought out the color in her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, her face bare of makeup save for a touch of lip balm. She looked younger than her 28 years, but there was a newfound steel in her posture. Are you sure about this? I asked her one final time as we settled into our seats. She nodded, arranging her napkin with deliberate care. I need closure, and I need him to see me, really see me, making this choice. Thomas Banks arrived precisely at noon, alone, a deviation from the plan that immediately put me on edge. He cut an imposing figure in his charcoal suit, silver hair immaculate, gold signet ring catching the light as he removed his leather gloves. Heads turned as he crossed the cafe, recognition dawning on several faces. He stood beside our table, not sitting until Annabelle gave a slight nod, a small but significant shift in power dynamics. Annabelle, he said, his deep voice betraying no emotion. Caroline. My name was an afterthought, barely acknowledged. Where's Preston? Annabelle asked directly. Thomas's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. My son is handling some pressing business. Matters. This conversation is between us. There is no us, Thomas, she replied evenly. Not anymore. A server approached, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the infamous Banks patriarch. Thomas ordered black coffee without looking at her. Annabelle asked for herbal tea with a smile and a thank you. Another small rebellion. When the server retreated, Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register meant for intimacy, but carrying an unmistakable edge. This situation has escalated beyond what's necessary, he said. The media circus, the investigations, the public spectacle. None of this serves either of our interests. I disagree, Annabelle replied calmly. The truth being revealed serves justice, and justice serves everyone. Thomas's expression hardened. Justice is a luxury, my dear. Practicality is what builds empires, what maintains families. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim folder, placing it on the table between them. I've prepared a more comprehensive offer than what Harrington proposed. Annabelle didn't touch the folder. I'm not interested in your money. Not just money. His tone shifted, becoming almost paternal. Full independence. A foundation of your own, separate from the bank's name but fully funded. A quiet, dignified divorce with generous terms. Your mother's business debts cleared and new opportunities arranged. I felt a surge of anger. So you admit to targeting my business. Thomas didn't even glance my way. Collateral effects of a complex situation. Collateral damage, Annabelle corrected. That's how you see people, isn't it? My mother, the communities affected by your land grabs, the workers exposed to chemicals your reports claimed were safe. Her voice remained steady, but I could see a muscle working in her jaw. Even me. Just collateral in your pursuit of more wealth, more power. For the first time, Thomas addressed me directly. Caroline, you raised a daughter with admirable principles but a limited understanding of reality. Perhaps you could help her see reason now. My daughter sees reality perfectly clearly, I replied. She simply rejected your version of it. The server returned with our drinks. When she departed, Thomas's demeanor changed subtly, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the steel beneath. Let me be blunt, he said, not touching his coffee. The investigations you've prompted are inconvenient, but ultimately manageable. What isn't manageable is the family's reputation being dragged through the mud by an ungrateful daughter-in-law with delusions of heroism. So that's what this is really about, Annabelle said with sudden clarity. Not the legal issues, your image, your legacy. The bank's name has stood for excellence for 5 generations, Thomas replied, an edge of genuine emotion breaking through his controlled facade. What we've built employs thousands, supports entire communities. One woman's misguided crusade shouldn't destroy that. And what about what you've destroyed? Annabelle asked quietly. The sacred lands, the habitats, the lives affected by your collateral damage. Thomas dismissed this with a wave of his manicured hand. Progress has costs, always has. And apparently so does marriage to your son, I interjected, like being locked outside in freezing temperatures for having an opinion. A flash of something, not quite shame, but perhaps discomfort, crossed his face before the mask returned. Preston can be overzealous in upholding family traditions, but discipline is necessary in maintaining order. It wasn't discipline, Annabelle said, her voice finally betraying emotion. It was cruelty. Calculated, deliberate cruelty designed to break me, to make me doubt myself. She leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. But it didn't work. It just showed me exactly who you are. Thomas studied her for a long moment, reassessing. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more dangerous. You know, I actually admire your spirit. It reminds me of my late wife, Preston's mother. She had that same fire, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I had such hopes for you, Annabelle. You could have been extraordinary within our world. I intend to be extraordinary outside of it, she replied. He sighed, reaching for his coffee at last. Then we have nothing more to discuss. He stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. The offer in that folder expires in 48 hours. After that, the gloves come off, completely. They were never on, I said quietly. Thomas looked down at me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time. No, Caroline, they were. If they hadn't been, you would know exactly what the Banks family is capable of when truly threatened. His gaze returned to Annabelle. Consider carefully, my dear. Not everyone has your best interests at heart, including those currently using you as their star witness. With that parting shot, he strode from the cafe, nodding to acquaintances as he went, every inch the respected businessman whose world remained perfectly under control. When the door closed behind him, Annabelle released a shaky breath. Are you all right? I asked, reaching for her hand across the table. She nodded, then pushed the untouched folder toward me. Let's see what he thinks I'm worth. I opened it and nearly gasped. The settlement offer was astronomical. Millions in cash, property, ongoing support. Enough to secure both our futures for life. But attached was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would silence Annabelle forever about everything she had witnessed or experienced as Preston's wife. The final page contained a separate clause regarding my design business, an offer to purchase it outright for 3 times its market value, with a 10-year consulting contract that would keep me comfortably employed but effectively under Bank's control. He's trying to buy us both, I said, closing the A folder. Of course he is, Annabelle replied. It's the only language he truly understands. Value, ownership, control. One of Diana's security officers approached our table, leaning down to speak quietly. Ms. Whitaker, Mrs. Banks, we've spotted Preston Banks entering through the kitchen. Security protocols suggest we leave immediately. Annabelle's face paled, but she stood with dignity, gathering her purse. Let's go. As we were escorted to a waiting car, I caught sight of Preston through the cafe window. Handsome, furious, watching us retreat with the cold calculation of a predator whose prey has momentarily escaped. In the car, Annabelle stared out the window at the Houston streets passing by, the city that had been her prison for 5 years. He's afraid, she said suddenly. Preston? Thomas. I've never seen him afraid before today. She turned to me, a strange light in her eyes. He's afraid because he knows I have nothing left to lose. And that makes me dangerous in a way money can't fix. I studied my daughter's profile, the determined set of her jaw, the clear eyes that had finally stopped scanning rooms for exits. Whatever happened next, Thomas Banks had already lost something irreplaceable, the power to make Annabelle afraid. And in the war we were fighting, that might be the most important victory of all. The Texas winter mellowed into spring, bringing bluebonnets to the highway medians and a steady rhythm to our new reality. 3 months had passed since the Christmas dinner that changed everything, and the world around us had transformed in ways neither Annabelle nor I could have imagined. My dining room had become the unofficial headquarters of what the media now called the bank's investigation. The antique table I'd rescued from a thrift store years ago was covered with documents, laptops, and legal pads. Diana Chen visited weekly, accompanied by increasingly higher-ranking officials from various agencies. Jessica Abrams, Annabelle's divorce attorney, had become a fixture in our lives, her razor-sharp mind and unflinching determination a perfect match for the Banks family's legal maneuvers. Most surprising was Michael Banks, Preston's estranged older brother, who had reached out to Annabelle after seeing the news coverage. His tech startup, it turned out, focused on sustainable energy solutions, a direct repudiation of his family's oil empire. He had provided valuable insights into the family's business practices and psychological warfare tactics. Thomas rules through isolation, he explained during one strategy session, his features softer than Preston's, despite their clear resemblance. He separates people from their support systems, then positions himself as the only path to security. That's exactly what he did to me, Annabelle confirmed, no longer flinching when discussing her marriage. And what he tried to do to my mother. Michael nodded grimly. It's how he controlled my mother until her death, how he controls Preston still. For all the activity surrounding us, Annabelle and I had found unexpected moments of peace. After the initial shock, my small business had begun to rebuild, not with the elite clientele who had abandoned me under Banks' pressure, but with new clients drawn to the integrity of our story. A women's shelter had hired me to redesign their community spaces. A sustainable building cooperative asked me to consult on eco-friendly interiors. My calendar wasn't as full as before, but the work felt more meaningful. Annabelle had discovered her voice as a writer, publishing a series of powerful essays about emotional and financial control in high society marriages. She spoke at women's conferences, sharing her story without shame or hesitation. The frightened woman I'd found shivering on that balcony had been replaced by a poised advocate who used her experience to help others recognize the subtle signs of coercion. The bank's empire, meanwhile, was showing cracks in its immaculate facade. The Attorney General's investigation had expanded to include tax evasion and securities fraud. 3 board members had resigned. Stock prices were falling. Preston had been photographed arguing with his father outside their downtown offices, his perfect composure finally slipping. But Thomas Banks wasn't a man who accepted defeat. His counterattacks came in waves: legal, delays, media manipulation, political pressure. He had friends in high places and wasn't afraid to call in favors, which is why Diana's expression was so grave when she arrived at our home on a warm April afternoon, a thick folder clutched in her hands. "They've found a judge willing to seal the evidence," she announced without preamble, setting the folder on our crowded table. "Judge Williamson, appointed by a governor whose campaigns the Banks family has funded for 2 decades. Can they do that?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "They can try," Diana replied, her determination unwavering despite the setback. "But there's a hearing tomorrow, one chance to argue against the motion before it's granted." Annabelle, who had been reviewing financial documents at the far end of the table, looked up with clear eyes. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony," Diana said simply. "Public on the record, detailing everything you witnessed, the land deals, the document destruction, the offshore accounts, and the abuse," Jessica added quietly from her position by the window. "The court needs to understand this isn't just about business practices, it's about a pattern of control and coercion that extends from the boardroom to the bedroom." Annabelle's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Will Preston be there?" "Most likely," Diana confirmed. "Thomas, too. Their attorneys will try to discredit you, portray you as unstable or vindictive." "I know," Annabelle said. "They've been doing that for months." And they had. The bank's PR machine had worked overtime, planting stories questioning Annabelle's mental health, suggesting she was bitter about Preston's supposed infidelities, implying she was being manipulated by radical environmentalists with an anti-business agenda. None of it had stuck, largely because Annabelle conducted herself with unwavering dignity in every public appearance. No rage-filled rants, no tearful breakdowns, just clear, factual statements delivered with the quiet certainty of someone speaking truth to power. "If I testify tomorrow," she said slowly, There's no going back. No possibility of settling quietly. There never was, Michael interjected gently. Thomas would have buried everything, waited until the attention died down, then found a way to exact revenge. It's his pattern. Annabelle nodded, reaching for my hand, across the document-strewn table. Then I'll do it. For every woman who's been silenced by wealth or power or fear. That night, as we prepared for the most public confrontation yet, Annabelle and I sat on my porch swing, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. The security detail Diana had arranged maintained a discreet presence at the perimeter of my small property, a necessary precaution after several concerning incidents in recent weeks. Are you afraid? I asked her softly. She considered the question seriously. Not of Thomas or Preston, she finally replied. Not anymore. But I am afraid of not being believed, of going through all this and having it dismissed because powerful men protect each other. I squeezed her hand. People will believe you because your truth shines through every word you speak. It always has. I learned that from you, she said, resting her head on my shoulder as she had as a child. To speak clearly, to stand firm, to trust that the truth matters even when it's inconvenient. Morning arrived with a media frenzy outside the downtown courthouse. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as our small procession, Annabelle, Diana, Jessica, Michael, and I, made our way through the throng. Annabelle wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her expression composed despite the chaos surrounding us. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Thomas and Preston Banks sat at the respondents' table, flanked by a team of attorneys in identical dark suits. Thomas looked as imperturbable as ever, but Preston's eyes followed. Annabelle's every movement, a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps regret, visible in his expression. Judge Williamson, a stern-faced man with thinning gray hair, called the hearing to order. The bank's attorneys presented their motion first, arguing that the evidence in question contained proprietary business information that could irreparably damage legitimate enterprises if made public. Diana countered forcefully, laying out the public interest in transparency when environmental safety and protected lands were at stake. The legal arguments grew technical, with citations and precedents flying back and forth across the courtroom. And then, finally, Annabelle was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand with measured steps, took the oath with a clear voice, and faced the crowded courtroom without flinching. For the next 2 hours, she laid bare the inner workings of the bank's empire, the shell companies, the falsified environmental reports, the strategic donations to regulatory officials. She described finding documents on Preston's laptop, overhearing conversations between father and son about handling inconvenient inspectors, witnessing the destruction of records before scheduled audits. Mrs. Banks, Diana asked toward the end of her direct examination, why did you wait so long to come forward with this information? Annabelle's gaze flickered briefly to Thomas before returning to Diana. Because I was afraid, she said simply. Not just for myself, but for my mother, for anyone who might stand with me against the Banks family. And what changed? Diana pressed gently. I realized that my fear was exactly what enabled their behavior, Annabelle replied, her voice gaining strength, that my silence was being used to hurt others. The communities affected by their environmental violations, the workers exposed to dangerous conditions, the public officials pressured to look the other way. The bank's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman, with calculating eyes, approached for cross-examination. Mrs. Banks, she began, emphasizing the name with subtle condescension, you've presented yourself as a victim of manipulation and control, yet you enjoyed the considerable benefits of the Banks family wealth for 5 years, didn't you? I lived in a beautiful prison, Annabelle replied evenly. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers didn't make it any less confining. And isn't it true that you only discovered these alleged improprieties after learning about your husband's relationship with another woman? The attorney pressed, introducing the infidelity narrative they'd been floating in the press. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I saw Preston shift uncomfortably in his seat. No, Annabelle said firmly. That's not true, and I believe Mr. Banks would confirm that if asked under oath. The attorney faltered momentarily, then switched tactics. You've suffered from anxiety and depression in the past, haven't you, Mrs. Banks? Conditions that might affect your perception of events or relationships? Before Diana could object, Annabelle leaned forward slightly. Yes, I have. Conditions that developed and worsened. During my marriage, particularly after I began finding evidence of illegal activity and experiencing increased restriction of my movements and communications. The cross-examination continued for another hour, each attempt to undermine Annabelle's credibility met with calm, factual responses that gradually shifted the energy in the courtroom. I watched the judge's expression change from skepticism to attention to something approaching respect. When Annabelle finally stepped down, her eyes met mine briefly, tired but clear, the look of someone who has finally set down a heavy burden they've carried too long. The bank's attorneys called no witnesses, relying instead on procedural arguments and appeals to business confidentiality. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Judge Williamson removed his glasses and addressed the courtroom. "I've heard enough to make a determination," he announced. "The motion to seal evidence is denied. The public interest in these matters outweighs confidentiality concerns, particularly given the credible testimony regarding potential illegal activity." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Thomas Banks remained perfectly still, only the whitening of his knuckles on the table edge betraying his reaction. Preston closed his eyes briefly, the facade of Banks' perfection cracking visibly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring the testimony and evidence presented today to a grand jury for consideration of potential criminal charges. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell with finality, and the courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters rushing for the doors, attorneys huddling with clients, spectators buzzing with excited conversation. As we gathered our things to leave, Preston suddenly broke away from his father's side and approached Annabelle. Diana's security team moved forward protectively, but Annabelle raised a hand to halt them. 5 minutes, she said quietly, in the presence of my counsel. Jessica nodded, positioning herself beside Annabelle as Preston stopped a respectful distance away. "Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual polish. "Us, in the beginning." Annabelle studied him for a long moment. "I think I loved the person I thought you were," she finally said. "And maybe you loved who you thought I could become. But neither of us was ever truly seen by the other." He nodded slowly, accepting this truth. "I never wanted," he began, then stopped. "I should have protected you. From him. From all of it. You should have protected yourself first," Annabelle replied gently. "You still could." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, a momentary glimpse of the man he might have been without Thomas Banks's influence. Then his father's voice cut through the courtroom, calling his name with unmistakable command. Preston straightened reflexively, the momentary vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of Banks' perfection. "Goodbye, Annabelle," he said formally, then turned and walked back to his father's side, the dutiful son once more. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions from behind security barriers. Annabelle paused at the top of the steps, the spring sunlight illuminating her face. "Ms. Banks, do you have a statement?" She smiled slightly. "It's Ms. Whitaker now, and yes, I do." She faced the cameras squarely. "The truth cannot be bought, buried, or intimidated into silence. Not by wealth, not by power, not by fear. That's all I have to say today." With that, she descended the steps, her head held high, no longer a prisoner of the Banks name or legacy. The war wasn't over. Thomas Banks would exhaust every legal maneuver, call in every favor, deploy every resource to fight the coming investigations. But something fundamental had shifted that day in the courtroom. The spell of invincibility surrounding the Banks dynasty had been broken, not by force or scandal, but by one woman's clear voice speaking truth without flinching. As we drove away from the courthouse, Annabelle reached for my hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what, sweetheart?" "For coming for me that night," she replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "For seeing me when no one else did. For teaching me that my voice matters." I squeezed her hand, remembering the frightened woman I'd carried from that frozen balcony just months ago. "You always had the strength," I told her. "You just needed to remember it." 1 year later, I stood in the doorway of my new design studio, watching the morning light filter through the tall windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The space was modest by luxury standards, but perfect for my needs. An old warehouse converted into creative offices, with exposed brick walls and polished, concrete floors. A hand-painted sign hung above the reception desk. Whitaker Designs, Spaces with Integrity. Below it, in smaller letters, in partnership with Second Chance Foundation. The foundation had been Annabelle's creation. Funded initially by her divorce settlement, which had been surprisingly generous once Preston broke ranks with his father, and later by grants and private donations. Its mission was twofold: environmental restoration of lands damaged by industrial exploitation and employment opportunities for women rebuilding their lives after leaving controlling relationships. My design firm had become the foundation's first business partner, training women in interior design skills and sustainable practices. What had begun as a survival strategy during the darkest days of the bank's battle had evolved into something meaningful, something that healed others while healing us. The contractor called, Annabelle announced, entering through the back door with 2 coffee cups in hand. The East Side project passed final inspection. We can start installing furniture next week. The East Side project was our largest undertaking yet, converting an abandoned community center into a multi-purpose space with career training facilities, counseling offices, and temporary housing for women in transition. It represented everything we had fought for: reclamation, restoration, renewal. That's wonderful news, I said, accepting the coffee she offered. How are the interviews going for the management position? Good. We have 3 strong candidates. She settled into one of the vintage chairs I'd reupholstered in vibrant fabric, all with experience in social services and all graduates of our training program. At 30, Annabelle had come into her own, not as a bank's trophy wife, but as a respected advocate and foundation director whose testimony had helped launch investigations into similar environmental violations across the state. Her series of articles on financial coercion in high society marriages had been nominated for a prestigious journalism award. There was talk of a book deal. Most importantly, the haunted look had vanished from her eyes. She laughed freely now, spoke her mind without hesitation, wore whatever she pleased instead of the designer uniforms Thomas had mandated. She had reclaimed herself piece by piece. Have you seen the news this morning? She asked, pulling out her phone. I shook my head. I was focused on the Morrison project presentations. She handed me her phone, open to a business news site. The headline made my breath catch: Banks Consolidated Faces. Chapter 11, Reorganization Amid Mounting Legal Troubles. The article detailed how the investigations sparked by Annabelle's testimony had uncovered decades of financial irregularities, environmental violations, and tax evasion. Major investors had pulled out. The stock had plummeted. Criminal charges against Thomas Banks were pending. It's finally happening, I murmured, scanning the article. After all this time. Annabelle nodded, her expression complex, not triumphant, but thoughtful. Michael called earlier. He's been appointed to the restructuring committee. Says they're going to refocus the company on renewable energy, sell off the oil interests. How do you feel about that? I asked carefully. She considered the question. Vindicated, but not vengeful. It was never about destroying the company. It was about stopping the harm. She sipped her coffee. Preston reached out too. This surprised me. Preston had maintained his distance since the divorce, moving to the London office of Banks Consolidated in what many saw as a self-imposed exile. What did he want? To apologize, properly this time. She set her cup down. He's in therapy, recognizing the patterns he learned from his father, trying to break them. Do you believe him? I asked. I believe he wants to change, she replied. Whether he can, that's his journey now, not mine. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of our first clients of the day, 2 women from the Foundation's training program, eager to show their design concepts for a local nonprofit's offices. I watched with pride as Annabelle welcomed them warmly, putting them at ease with her genuine interest in their ideas. Later that evening, we celebrated the East Side project milestone with a small gathering at my home. Diana Chen, now heading a statewide environmental protection initiative. Jessica Abrams, whose law practice now specialized in helping women navigate financial independence after controlling relationships. Michael Banks, working to transform his family's business legacy, and several graduates of our foundation programs who had become dear friends. As twilight deepened into night, Annabelle raised her glass in a toast. To reclamation, she said, her eyes meeting mine across the table. Of land, of dignity, of self. To reclamation, we echoed, glasses clinking in the soft light. After our guests had departed, Annabelle and I sat on the porch swing as we often did, watching the stars emerge in the Texas sky. She had her own apartment now, a sun-filled space she had chosen and furnished herself, but still spent many evenings at my home, our bond stronger than ever after all we had weathered together. I've been thinking about that night, she said quietly. Christmas Eve at the bank's estate, when you found me on the terrace. I nodded, the memory still sharp despite the passage of time. I was so cold I couldn't feel anything anymore, she continued. Not my hands, not my feet, not even my fear. It was like I'd disappeared into the ice. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting the porch light. And then you came through those doors like some avenging angel, and suddenly I existed again. I mattered again. I took her hand, remembering the blue-tinged skin, the violent trembling, the despair in her eyes that night. You always mattered, Annabelle. Always. I know that now, she said, but I needed you to remind me then. She smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Do you remember what you said to them when you carried me inside? I know about the buyout, I quoted softly. She laughed. 5 words that changed everything. It wasn't the words, I told her. It was you finding the courage to stand in your truth, even when everything and everyone around you was trying to bury it. We fell silent, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, a distant train whistle, the gentle creak of the porch swing, the peaceful rhythm of ordinary life reclaimed. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Texas spring day. I arrived at the studio early to prepare for a client meeting, unlocking the door to find a small envelope that had been slipped underneath. Inside was a newspaper clipping, Thomas Banks being escorted from his offices by federal agents, his empire crumbling around him. No note accompanied it, but it didn't need one. The sender was clear. Michael, keeping us informed as promised. I pinned the clipping to our inspiration board alongside photographs of our completed projects, quotes from women whose lives had been transformed by the foundation, and sketches of future dreams yet to be realized. When Annabelle arrived an hour later, she noticed it immediately. She studied it for a long moment, then turned to me with serene eyes. It's over, she said simply. And it was. Not with violence or vengeance or even victory in the traditional sense, but with truth finally emerging from beneath the ice, rising to the surface where it had always belonged. Annabelle linked her arm through mine as we prepared to face the day ahead, not as victims or even survivors, but as builders of something new from the fragments of what had been broken. Money can buy power, comfort, and silence, she said thoughtfully, echoing words she had written in her most widely shared essay. But it cannot erase a mother's instinct. And when love is stronger than fear, even empires fall. I smiled, recognizing my own strength reflected in my daughter's eyes. We had come through the winter, and spring, with all its possibilities, stretched before us like an open road.